Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
Well, last week we spoke about Benjamin Disraeli and the Disraeli myth with author Emily Jones, and this week we're switching to a much more Labour theme and moving ourselves a little bit further on in the chronology as well.
Yes, we're looking at the life of Margaret Bondfield, who was the first woman cabinet minister. She was in the 1929 Labour cabinet, and she'd also served as a junior minister in the very first Labour government in 1924. And we're speaking to Nan Sloane, who's written the book Margaret Bondfield, The Life and Times of Britain's First Female Cabinet Minister.
There's a link to where you can buy the book in the show notes, but here's our discussion with Nan. Well, Nan, today we're discussing really a lot of firsts. We're talking about the joint first Labour woman MP, the first woman Privy Councillor, the first woman Minister and Cabinet Minister, the first woman to lead the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, or certainly to chair its General Council, and also the first proper biography of Margaret Bondfield as well, which is the new book that you brought out, Margaret Bondfield, The Life and Times of Britain's First Female Cabinet Minister. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast to discuss these many, many firsts.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me.
So, Nan, I think for many of us who are in the Labour Party or interested in Labour history, Margaret Bondfield is a name that we'll know, but many won't know a great deal about her life. And she was someone I knew had come from a working class background. I've heard her described over the years as something like a humble seamstress or something like that. But actually, one of the things that struck me early on in reading your book was really just about how difficult her early life was, to be one of 11 surviving children, to be moved around so much, the sense of dislocation in her early life, the lack of stability in being moved from family member to family member, the sense of proximity to death and family members dying around her, the financial insecurity and precarity that her father experienced, that she and her siblings and mother experienced, the financial exhaustion, and then her early working life as well, where she's working these extremely long hours, 65 hours a week, this whole system of living in where you're under the kind of control of your employer. How do you think that all of these experiences that Margaret Bondfield had in her early life shaped her politics? Was she unusual in having these kinds of experiences, or was this fairly typical for a working class woman in the late Victorian era?
Those are two slightly separate questions, and I'll deal with them in reverse order. The kind of childhood that she had was not untypical. I think it was at the extreme end of not untypical. But at a time when there was no ability to limit large families, particularly in working class communities, there were not always the resources to bring up large numbers of children. It simply was not possible to do. And so it was not uncommon to farm children out, as we would see it, to various relations and friends and all the rest of it. There weren't boarding schools for working class children, but upper class families did and sometimes still do much the same with their children, but it's boarding schools and educational and viewed differently. In working class families, we might look at it and think, oh, that's terrible. But from the point of view of the family, what they are trying to do is ensure that the child gets fed, gets some attention, and is looked after by people they know and can trust. And sometimes that went very well. Unfortunately, in Margaret Bondfield's case, it didn't go so well. And I think one of the main things that she took from her childhood was an absolute determination never to be dependent on anybody ever, almost in any way, and much of her adult life is driven by a need for independence and a need for control over what is happening to her, married with the ability to take risk, which I think also comes from her youth and a feeling of, well, I've got nothing to lose. Why don't I just leave Brighton and go to London with hardly any money and hope for the best? Which is what she did as soon as she'd finished her apprenticeship. So I think it was hugely influential. I also think it's interesting that in later life, she and her advocates always portrayed her childhood as very happy rural childhood. And, you know, you're sort of born in cottages and you have this picture of cottage with roses round the door and all the rest of it. And it's only when she got really to writing her autobiography very late in life that she was more honest about what her childhood had actually been like. But you also pick it up in stray things. In 1924, she led an inquiry in Canada into migrant children and how they were looked after, or as obviously turns out, not, and produced a report which made a whole string of recommendations about the care of migrant children, which the Canadian government accepted pretty much entirely and implemented. And I think that's also the same thing she said at the time. I know what it's like to be uprooted and moved, and she had a great empathy for people who did not have control over their lives. And I think that also came from an understanding of what it was like to be constantly at somebody else's behest.
I think one of the challenges for us today when thinking about historical figures, and particularly actually in the late Victorian and the early parts of the 20th century, is now that we're in quite a secular age, we don't often think about religion as being a dominating factor in a person's life. Or if it is, it's quite remarkable when we have politicians who are very shaped by their faith. But of course, if we wind the clock back a century and a half, it was very common and very typical for people to not just be religiously observant, but quite often religiously devout. And you write in the book about how Bondfield retained a strong Christian faith throughout her life. I wonder how religion shaped her politics, and particularly given the fact that quite often socialism is spoken about in a way that almost makes it sound quasi-religious. People talk about being converted to socialism in the way that you might be converted to a faith. So how does her Christian faith sit alongside her socialist views and influence her?
Well, she was brought up as a Congregationalist, but there was also a strong streak of Methodism in her family, and people involved in those particular independent churches tended to the left. I don't think, as with any group of people, you can't say everybody was, because it's so manifestly not true, but tended towards the left. And certainly her parents were liberals with a capital L and so on. And she herself retained a very strong sense of religion, was very committed. When she went to Brighton and was an apprentice in a draper's shop in Brighton, she was involved with the Congregational Church there. The Congregational Church was one of the very few churches that allowed women preachers. So, interestingly, given that in her later life she was very well known as a public speaker, it's entirely possible the first time she heard a woman speak in a position of authority would have been at church. And she, when she went to London, most of her letters of introduction and so on that she took with her were to people at her church, because, you know, it's supposedly a place of safety for young people in London. When she got involved with the trade union movement, though, the church took the view that trade union activities were incompatible with Christianity, and said she would have to choose involvement in the church or involvement in the union. And she says unhesitatingly chose the union. And she then did not go back to organised religion for 20 years until really the outbreak of the First World War, when a lot of people obviously returned to earlier religious loyalties. But she was never again part of a church in the same way. She took to attending lots of different kinds of churches. When she was in America, she went to lots of different churches just to see what was happening. She retained a very strong sense of herself as a Christian and was very driven by Christian values, but those values also clashed with some aspects of her lifestyle. And so it was not without tension, and sometimes became very fraught, and sometimes the God that she had in mind was an avenging God or a punishing God rather than a loving God. So it was a complicated relationship with religion, but it was always there right to the end of her life.
You can hear in some of her writings that you reproduced in the book quite a strong Christian influence. I think some of them even sound somewhat Wesleyan, actually, in the way. So there's one that I'll just read that comes from one of her early trade unionist newspaper writings, where she says, begin to live as you have it in you to live. Realize the grand possibilities now lying dormant within you. Your heart will be full of love for humanity. You will recognize in the man or woman in the street your brother, your sister, and your life will be made beautiful by the love of comrades. I mean, it to me, it just sounds so, Methodist, or, of that particular tradition.
Absolutely.
So how does she make the transition into socialist politics? You talk in the book about a society that she joins called the Ideal Club, and how she starts to rub shoulders with some of the people who become very significant, or already were at that time very significant, in the early Labour Party's formation and the predecessor organizations to that, people like George Bernard Shaw and Ramsay MacDonald and Beatrice Webb. How does someone who comes from this very poor background, who is working all hours and really has that one day a week to go to church, how does she then make the transition into political activism?
That is a very good question, because on one level, the answer is a lot of luck and just being in the right place at the right time. But that doesn't explain why she took to it like a duck to water. It was almost like as soon as she got into that environment, she felt as though she'd come home and she was in the right place, and this was where her life was going to be, and had a very strong sense of that, particularly with the trade union movement. In London in the 1890s, it was packed with young people who'd gone there looking for jobs and fortunes and all the rest of it, as capital cities always are, but particularly so, I think, at that turn of the century period when London was growing and there was a lot of a sense of possibility about it. And so there was a lot of anxiety about what all these young people were doing, milling about in an uncontrolled way. And people set up lots of youth clubs and development opportunities and night schools and all kinds of things to try to make sure that they were using their leisure time in a productive manner. And the Ideal Club seems to have been recommended to her by somebody at the church. And I can imagine she just went along on spec to see what this was. And just by absolute chance, it happened to be a club for young people set up by George Bernard Shaw, the Webbs and the Fabian Society. So you can imagine if you suddenly fall into that environment, with people like people of that. I was going to say ilk, but what I mean is sort of people living on that kind of plane rather than the plane of where do I get the next penny from. It's revelatory, and they seem to have struck a balance between the political and the educational and people enjoying themselves. So they had dances and excursions and all that kind of thing, but they also had debates, and they had a mock parliament where she sat as the MP for Taunton, and they had campaigns like George Bernard Shaw, when he got elected onto the new St Pancras Council after local government reorganisation, got the first women's toilets in Camden and public toilets, and this was a great victory for progressive socialist politics. And I think all of that she was in her very early 20s, just energised her and opened a whole new world to her, combined with finding the trade union movement, again, completely by chance, and getting involved in that, and realising that you didn't have to be all the time controlled by your employers, that you could fight back, that there were things you could do, and that she could do them. And I think the combination of those two very different sets of people, the sort of Fabian Society on the one side, and not just socialists, but the General Secretary of the Shop Workers Union was in the precursor to the Communist Party. So two extremes almost of the socialist movement as it then was, and she just plunged into both and took to them completely.
Her entry into the trade union movement is the sort of stroke of luck is even more extraordinary in the way that you tell it in the book, where Margaret Bondfield apparently saw an advert for joining a union in a fish and chip newspaper wrapper. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, and she read it. Obviously, the employers didn't feed the people. Their board was supposed to be part of their salary, but obviously it was the employers' interests to feed them as cheaply as possible, and so their food was often inadequate for people who were in very physical jobs on the move all 10 hours a day, and so they often used to go out for lunch. And she describes fish and chips as the food of the very poor. If only is all I can say nowadays. And it was literally the wrapping paper on the fish and chips was a letter from the General Secretary of the Shop Workers Union, which was tiny, saying, we need people to come and join and help us. And she just thought, well, I have nothing to lose. I'll just give it a go, and did.
And the trade union movement really transforms her life as she makes the move eventually from working in shops to becoming a trade union employee and organizer, and eventually, as you write in the book, and I think this is something that she should be much more better remembered for, the most senior trade unionist in the country at the sort of pinnacle of her career in the labor movement. And there in the book, you also give another example of how she takes these risks. One of the things that struck me was she in effect volunteers to be an undercover reporter about her industry and do write-ups about the poor employment practices in her workplace and feed those to the union and get those published, which of course would put her in enormous personal exposure, and also effectively she's writing off her entire career prospects, not working in the union but working in shops. Can you say a little bit more about that transition she makes to working in the trade union movement and how that all came about?
She started off as a volunteer, and as everybody does in the trade union movement, and then but spent more and more time on it. And in the course of that was introduced to some women who did inquiries into women's working conditions in various industries, and they were trying to put together something around shop work, but it was very difficult because they couldn't get inside it because they were middle class women, very educated, intelligent, campaigning women, but not likely to be accepted as shop assistants if they turned up and tried to get a story from the inside. And shop assistants were not prepared to talk to them because employers tended to make any contact with trade unions or with people who were trying to change working conditions a sackable offence. And so people in the industry were very, very wary of talking to anybody who they knew to be involved in anything like that. And so they were looking for somebody who could do it from the inside. And she was obviously ideal because she had a job already. She'd served an apprenticeship. She was undoubtedly employable. And she knew exactly what to look for. She knew everything about how that industry operated. And so they had a conversation with her, and she apparently immediately said, yes, I will do it. And the plan was she would start at the very high-end shops in the West End, start at Mayfair, start with the worst, with the ones they knew to be very... Obviously, there were some good employers, but they were a minority. Start with the worst of them, and then in the top of the scale, and then as she got herself sacked or left, her references would gradually get worse and worse until she would only be employable in the poorest of shops in the East End. And that's basically what she did. But of course, in the course of that, she completely destroyed any chance of ever being employed as a shop worker again, because the first question any potential employer would ask is, why have you worked in so many places over the course of this period? So now I think the narrative runs that she did that, and then, oh look, somebody gave the union enough to employ another member of staff, so we've employed Miss Bondfield. I think that deal was probably done at a much earlier stage, and that this anonymous donation came from the women who had organised the inquiry in the first place, because I think there's risk and then there's risk, and she was seriously risking destitution by the end of it. But it was then published as a series of articles in newspapers. There was a big hoo-ha over the conditions of shop workers. It didn't change things overnight, but it was part of a slow progression towards the abolition of in particular, the living-in system. And the big stores who were in their early stages, some of them abandoned living in quite quickly. So places like, I think, Debenhams, by 1910 were not using living in at all. It must have been a nightmare to organise, apart from anything else. So it certainly contributed to that, but it also got her profile, got her well known in the trade union movement much, and she was still very young. She was still only 24 when she did this. So it was a very brave thing to do, I think.
I wanted to begin to move on to her career in politics and her life in politics. But I wanted to start by asking about something you said earlier on. You said she becomes known as being a public speaker. And public speaking, of course, is one of those demands of politics, the demand on pretty much everybody who goes into politics. But it's also quite a hard skill to acquire for a lot of people, and something many people feel sort of uncertain, very nervous about. I ask this question in part because I'm aware that you spend a lot of time yourself, as well as being a historian, training and supporting, in particular, women candidates who want to go on and get elected into an elected office, and supporting them with the skills that they need to do so. So thinking about Bondfield and her journey into politics, and in particular about her public speaking. What stood out to me is a line you wrote in the book. In fact, it stood out to both of us because we have a connection to Queen Mary in London, where you quote Bondfield as saying, "I am often asked how I learned the art of public speaking. I didn't. I discovered it at a great meeting held at the Mile End People's Palace." I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how she was as a public speaker, how comfortably she took to it, and that discovery that she made in Mile End.
Yes, that is a very good story, and I'm perfectly prepared to believe it. But I also don't quite believe that it was her first experience of any kind of public speaking. She certainly had a very good singing voice. She sang in church choir. She had a good, strong contralto singing voice. That doesn't always translate into a good speaking voice, but it can be a great help. She must also have done some speaking to groups of people in the very early stages of her trade union career, because that's in the nature of the early stages of a trade union career. If you're going to go anywhere, you have to be able to. What I do think is that was probably the first occasion on which she was asked to speak to a large group of people. And I suspect they had been asking her to speak at things before that, and she'd done a lot of, oh, no, get somebody better kind of thing that people do. And this was just dropped on her. She was asked to do the vote of thanks, and it was just, she couldn't really get out of it, and so she had to stand up and do it. And she said she couldn't remember anything that she said, and I imagine that is indeed the case, because it can be terrifying. A large audience can be terrifying if you're not used to it. But she obviously did very well at it, and then she will have got herself training. She would have got people who knew what they were doing to help her to develop. At the time, there was no amplification, so if you were going to be a public speaker, you had to know how to look after your voice. You had to know how to project. Later on in that decade, she was involved with various theatrical productions. I can't believe that she didn't collar people and get them to help her with both delivery and also how do you keep a voice working. And in later life, she had a throat specialist she went to regularly just to keep her voice in working order. And then it's a matter at that time of practice and of doing it constantly. They had to do a lot of speaking outdoors to large audiences, again, with no amplification. And there's this, we do have this sort of idea that women didn't do public speaking, but of course, at the time, the country was awash with women doing public speaking. So the entire suffrage movement was standing on platforms, speaking to people. People like, this is not just Margaret Bondfield, there's Mary MacArthur and others in the trade union movement who were doing the same. They used to do a thing of you, when they were recruiting, of you would stand outside the factory or shop or whatever it was on a chair or a stool and just start speaking and see how many people you could get round you to come and listen. So it was not even you had the audience there. It was your job to attract the audience. And when she went to the first visit to America, that was specifically to help the American trade union movement recruit women in the same way. So she got a lot of practice. She got a lot of experience very quickly. Obviously, public speaking style at that time was very different from what we would expect, much more theatrical. They were projecting to the back of very large crowds. If you spoke in the Albert Hall, for instance, which she did frequently, you had to be able to project to the top and the back as much as to the front. And so you very quickly gained those skills, or you weren't going to have a career in public speaking. But it also meant it was more theatrical than we would expect now. It was more playing to the back of the house, as it were. And now I think it's like the difference between being on a stage and being on film. Nowadays, we expect our public speakers to be more filmic, more restrained in both their language and their movement. Then they were expected to be much more theatrical, much more declamatory, able to speak at much greater length. I mean, Gladstone, 4 hours and still going. Not for us now, I don't think. But certainly, even by the time they got into the 20th century, still talking about people, people like MacDonald and others could go for a couple of hours, and you had to hold the audience for that period of time. It was a different skill, but I think she was very effective at it.
It's something that comes through in quite a few biographies, I think, about the 1920s more broadly, that politicians sometimes struggle to adapt to radio when it's coming in, because the skill that they've mastered is the sort of oratory that you've just described. And one of the examples that always sticks in my mind is when they do some of the first party political broadcasts on the BBC. Baldwin does very well at it because he's adapted to the fact and he's anticipated what it means to speak to radio. Whereas MacDonald, I think in his case, what they do is they use a recording of a speech he's giving, and it doesn't work in the context of listening to it in your own home. But it would have worked if the listener was one of 5,000 people in that auditorium. So it's clearly very different skills. And you're right, surely the challenge of what Margaret Bondfield and others really had to come to terms with and master as a skill at that time is pretty much gone.
And also
Yes.
Bondfield in the House of Commons, which you write about, Nan, in the book, and how transitioning from addressing the People's Palace in Mile End to the Commons Chamber is actually in itself quite a transition and a difficult one for her, at least at the very start for her.
Well, her first speech in Parliament was a flop. Her maiden speech was for all the delivery, the topic, the place in the debate at which she spoke. The whole thing was just wrong, and she fixed it and became a good speaker in the House. But as you say, the transition was really tricky, and some trade union MPs never quite made the transition, were never able to project in the House what they were able to do outside it. MacDonald's problem was that when he was making speeches, he didn't stand still. He used to stride up and down the stage and wave his arms about. And so when they tried to record this speech, he couldn't remember to stand still in front of the microphone. And so he was walking up and down. So on the recording, it sort of comes and goes as he... Whereas, as you say, Baldwin worked out this is a chat with people in their houses, and it took a very different approach. And what they also did was have radio voices. Mm-hmm. And so when you listen to recordings of Margaret Bondfield, she's got these strangulated vowels that people had, and yet in normal life she still spoke with a West Country accent. But you don't hear it on the radio recordings because there's a very sort of telephone voice, radio voice kind of thing going on, which is quite frustrating because you lose the character with that. You lose all the warmth and the things that people comment on about her. It gets lost in translation in the radio.
You write in the book about many of the strong female friendships and relationships that Margaret Bondfield had, and that there's fairly strong circumstantial evidence that Margaret Bondfield was probably a lesbian. To what extent was her private life ever perceived by her or by others to be a potential political liability? Was it something that if you were in a same-sex partnership as a woman, that there would be speculation or negativity about that, or was it at that time possible for two women to live together, and that that kind of speculation might not be there in the same way that perhaps if two adult men lived together, that there might be more speculation about their sexuality?
Women live together all the time for a whole range of reasons, some of which were about just, two unmarried women is just cheaper, given that unmarried women were more likely to be poor than married women were. They had less access to income. So that was not a no. However, there was always speculation around Margaret Bondfield, and many other women also believed to be lesbian, because the nature of the relationship is different. It is a relationship. It is not a friendship. It may also be a friendship, but it is a relationship. And the problem that she and other women, of whom there were more than a few in that position, was that it was very different from how men were perceived. In men's case, it was illegal, it was terrible, it was all the things that we know about. Case of women who were lesbians were in a state of arrested development. So their emotional and intellectual development had got stuck at about 14 or 15, which is why they were still having crushes on women. And, it was all very juvenile, perceived as very juvenile. They haven't grown up properly. They hadn't grown into a proper grown-up relationship, which was with men. They were women without children, so they did not have that element of adult female responsibility. They were independent. They were not, their lives were not directed or dictated by husbands. And there was a general view that they were less competent, less able, and less to be trusted because of this, the fact that they were emotionally and intellectually basically just teenagers. And if you are aspiring to run the country, this is not necessarily the perception that you want people to have of you. And so both Margaret Bondfield and I'm quite sure others simply did not refer to it ever under any circumstances. But of course other people did. There are comments from friends about, these relationships are so difficult, they tend to be up and down so much, and people falling out with each other all the time. Why do they need to be so intense? And the occasional snidey remark in newspapers. But generally, as long as you didn't refer to it, nobody else would. If you made a thing about it, then that was it. You'd be done for. And she had the complication also. She had two complications. One was obviously thinking that it was against her religion, but also thinking that because she also tended to, she did have a series of mental breakdowns over the years, but the two things put together would be absolutely fatal to a political career. And so it was very difficult managing all that. There are lots of people who say because the evidence is circumstantial, that jumping to the conclusion, we should just say she may have been, we don't know. But I think you then lose a whole element of what drove her and what just the difficulties that she had to contend with is as much the amount of concealment that had to go on and the difficulty of conducting a relationship under pressure that there was on her just gets removed from the whole thing, and we don't really understand her in the same way as once you think, well, she was also contending with all of this. some of her life becomes easier to understand and to empathise with.
Thinking about her parliamentary career, she's clearly both, well, it struck me that she is both a victim but also a beneficiary of the political volatility of the 1920s. A beneficiary in the sense that it's the first time that you're getting serious numbers of Labour MPs elected into Parliament, but also a victim in the sense that her stints in Parliament are quite short and her overall time in Parliament is really quite brief. Certainly if we compare it to, say, other generations of pioneering women Labour politicians, somebody like Barbara Castle, who enters Parliament in 1945, stays an MP until the end of the 70s, but basically is either an MP, MEP or peer for the remainder of her life. Bonfield's political career clearly looks very different to that. So she gets in at the 1923 general election for Northampton, but only for a very brief period of time. What was her connection to Northampton or the temptation to stand there? Was it?
Nothing whatsoever. This comes as a shock to us, but the idea that an MP should be local to where they represent is entirely a recent invention. And in previous generations, there was much less focus on that. You got a seat wherever you could get one. And Northampton came up. She'd fought the previous general election in 1922 there, and she'd also fought a by-election there. And so she'd been hacking away at, it was a Liberal MP, she'd been hacking away at the majority for some time. But it was where was there a seat, send so-and-so there. And they were very pleased to have her. She was a national figure and she brought, she could have MacDonald there to launch her campaigns, and they could get a lot of interest and excitement out of having a very high-profile candidate. But she had no more connection with Northampton in 1923 than she did with Wallsend in 1926, which is a seat she represented until 1931. But nobody else did either. Keir Hardie never represented a Scottish seat, London and South Wales. MacDonald represented Leicester and then a South Wales seat. Arthur Henderson, who was variously General Secretary and Leader and Foreign Secretary and all kinds of things, had 7 seats over the course of his parliamentary career and lost them all at one point or another and just moved on to the next one. So there wasn't that expectation that we have. It was much more about we need to get X into Parliament, where is a seat that they can win. And I have to say also at the time, it wasn't even that women got less winnable seats, because it was Arthur Henderson, who was the General Secretary, handing out the seats, and he was giving himself the most marginal seat. So this sort of whole narrative about seats, localism, women being badly done to, slightly falls apart. It is true that Labour women tended to have seats with lower majorities than Conservative women, but that's because in the early days, many of the Conservative women inherited seats from male relatives that had much higher majorities. Obviously, that reduced as time went on. But in the early days, they had very different kinds of seats.
So just for the benefit of listeners then, so she gets in 1923 when Baldwin goes to the country for Northampton. There's an election the following year, which is a Tory landslide, and she's out. Then she gets in a by-election in 1926 for Wallsend, she mentioned, up in Tyneside. And then she's there until 1931, which then becomes a national government landslide. And we'll come on to talk about the particularities of that in a moment. But in that relatively brief time that she is in Parliament, what assessment do people make of her as a parliamentarian?
As a parliamentarian, she had a good reputation. She was a good speaker after a rocky start. Because she went straight into government, so she was a government minister 6 weeks after she was elected, which is, there was no time to do anything other than get your feet under the table at the ministry. She and a number of others in that position never really had time to get to grips with all the, parliamentary procedure, and this is how we've done it for the last 300 years, so we'll carry on like this kind of thing that may or may not go on. And so that, and also, this is one of the problems that women had. She was less able to get involved with the social side of Parliament because she was teetotal. Women were not allowed in bars on their own in Parliament, even after they were members. Parliament took quite a long time to catch up with the idea that women might be members, and there were very few of them. So she never quite got into the sort of day-to-day life of Parliament in the way that people would expect to do now. But she was generally accounted as a good parliamentarian, a good performer at the dispatch box, and she always got on very well with people. She was very personable, very charming. People liked her. People on both sides of the House liked her and got on with her. So from that side, I think not so much of a problem. The problem comes with where she spent most of her career, which was in government, in one way or another. The 10 months of the 1924 government, which I think she was quite acute about and understood what had happened. And the 29 to 31 government, which I think she also understood what had happened but couldn't do very much about for various reasons.
I was very struck in the book by the contrasts of her two stints in ministerial office. That first stint, as you say, when she's Under Secretary of State for Labour, the Minister for Labour, Tom Shaw, and they're sort of working in a partnership at the Ministry for Labour, and Shaw is not brilliant, at least in your telling of it. He's a bit out of his depth, and it actually seems like Bondfield is really keeping the show on the road, and it gets some successes there about the waiting periods for unemployment, the requirement for women to accept domestic service if they couldn't find work elsewhere. The report that you mentioned at the start of this conversation, when she goes to Canada and is in Canada at the time the election's called in Edmonton, Alberta, about children being sent overseas. So it's a really, substantial work that she's doing in this minority Labour government that's not going to last very long. And then you contrast that from when she enters the cabinet and becomes Minister for Labour herself in 29. And at least I grew frustrated about reading that period in office in the book, because I felt up to that point, you just have this tremendous sense that Margaret Bondfield, that she's sort of an unstoppable character, and she's just going up and up and up the ranks against all the odds. And then she becomes the first woman cabinet minister. And we should also say another first that you didn't mention, he was first woman to speak from the despatch box as well. I was just thinking of that. And then it feels like she gets a bit stuck. She doesn't seem to, at least the way I see it, she sort of seems to lose her finger on the pulse in a way that she, as you say, she supports policies like the Anomalies Bill, which you write about, which turns sections of the trade union movement and the women's movement quite strongly against her. She keeps advocating for more borrowing, but at the same time saying she doesn't personally agree with borrowing, but she's asking for more borrowing. I mean, what happens there in when she becomes a cabinet minister?
Well, I think the Wall Street crash is enough to stop anybody in their tracks, and it stopped more than just her. I think it's quite difficult now to remember quite how bad that was, and quite how shocking and stunning to everybody that was. And the fact that nobody knew what to do about it. Nobody had been in this position before. Most of the cabinet had had 10 months experience of government, plus the 3 months in between. So 1924 plus 3 months of office before the Wall Street crash happened. They had no more idea of what to do than anybody else had. And they took quite a long time, I think, to get their heads round that this had happened and that there wasn't, it was a global crisis. It was not just Britain. It was not just the British economy. And in the case of the Ministry of Labour, we sort of think of that as being to do with employment, but it actually wasn't. It was what we would now call the benefits bit of work and pensions. So she was responsible for the unemployment fund and for all the related things that were a part of the National Insurance Fund, but not for employment policy, which was given to a separate committee, which she did not sit on. And so she had half the problem, as it were, without access to the other half of the problem. And the unemployment fund, which had been in trouble since before 1924 and was, by the time she got back to it in 1929, in much worse state than it had been, just went off a cliff after the Wall Street crash. So, by the beginning of 1930, there were over 1.5 million unemployed. The unemployment fund, which was supposed to keep paying out benefits, was over 40 million in deficit. And that was growing all the time as the number of unemployed went up by roughly 100,000 a month. The amount of income to the fund went down. And so there was clearly a problem to which nobody had the solution. You can't borrow to cover that much of a rapidly developing problem, though others in the government thought that you could. She never thought that you could, but was forced into the corner of having to do it, or the fund collapses. And of course, that is eventually what happened when you get into 1931, after the May report on the whole system came out and was projecting massive deficits for the future, and confidence collapsed and the government collapsed with it. So I think on one level, she was just up against things that nobody could have dealt with, and nobody else in the government knew how to deal with either. So it's not just that she failed in the face of the crisis, but so did all the men who were in it with her. What she did do was compound it by some really stupid mistakes, like excluding the unions from being involved in the discussions as part of the solution. The unions wanted there to be no cuts, never possible. And the opposition wanted to abolish publicly provided benefits. Again, never going to happen, but much more understandable when you think that the whole system had been in existence for less than 20 years. So we now think of it as immutable. It's only really been there since the People's Budget in 1910 and the National Insurance Acts from that point. So there was still a debate going on about, was the public purse the right place from which to support the unemployed and all the rest of it. And she managed to exclude the unions from that debate, to not have them in the room, which is a terrible mistake because it meant she made enemies where she didn't need to. There's a whole discussion about whether or not married women counted as genuinely seeking work. And the conclusion was that they did not, because they could be supported by their husbands and therefore didn't need to work and were therefore not genuinely seeking work, which is a very tenuous argument at the best of times. But she went with it. And so she lost many people in the women's movement who might otherwise have gritted their teeth and cut her some slack. So one way and another, she managed to make a lot of enemies in a very short space of time, at a time where she really needed them. And she was not the only person to do that, because I think MacDonald probably outdid her in the enemy-making department by the end. But she certainly didn't help herself, didn't help her reputation, and by making enemies on both sides of the argument, she didn't have advocates on either. And I think that has been part of the reason why she's been forgotten subsequently.
When it came to the end of that Labour government and Ramsay MacDonald forming the national government in August 1931, an event that Clement Attlee once described as the greatest betrayal in the history of the Labour movement, there is some debate about Margaret Bondfield's positioning at that particular moment. And you share in the book some fascinating correspondence between Bondfield and MacDonald, in which I have to say, just on the face of it reading, it does sound a bit like Bondfield is potentially presenting herself as available to serving in that national government, and then MacDonald is kind of putting her down gently, saying that there's thank you, not quite thank you for offering, but in a sense, to me, it seems like he's getting close to that, and then saying, but there's no room. You in the book, if I'm remembering correctly, are a little more skeptical of the idea that Bondfield was keen to join the national government. I wonder if you could tell us what your take is on whether she was thinking of jumping ship to the national government or not.
I think she probably entertained some thoughts of it right at the beginning. But I think she was also in the early stages of the breakdown, which she subsequently had, and spent quite a long time in a clinic across the period of the 1931 general election. And when you look at the letter that she wrote to him and sort of, compare the writing with things that she wrote during previous breakdowns, it is the same, and normally her writing is a scrawl across the paper, and this is tiny little writing crammed into the top corner of the paper. And MacDonald knew her very well, and had first met her in the 1890s at the Ideal Club, and had been close friends ever since. So he knew her very well, and I think he probably recognised what kind of a state she was in, apart from anything else. That's not to say that if he'd written back and said, "Oh yes, please stay on," that she might not have considered it. But I don't think she would have done it in the end, because who knows what people thought, because the narrative, I don't think, is quite as we usually have it, because we take the betrayal as the forming of the national government. The actual betrayal and the point at which he was expelled was breaking his promise over it not being a coupon election, which effectively sealed the party's electoral fate at the election. At the time, I don't think she would have done it in the end. I think she would have realised that would be it, that she would lose her trade union connection, that there would be no way back. But everybody considered it. I think any one of them who says they didn't actively consider what to do would not be telling the truth, because of course you would consider what to do. And it's also worth remembering that in the public there was massive demand for a national government. The public wanted they wanted the crisis treated like a wartime emergency, and for there to be effectively a wartime government. And that's what they voted for. I mean, the majority for the government in the 1931 election was well over 500. And the Labour Party was crushed. So I think everybody considered it, but most people in the end didn't do it.
There's a great line that you quote from MacDonald in the book, from that correspondence, where he writes, "I am trying to involve very few of my friends in the new government, because so far as one can see, it means their political death." And that certainly ended up being right, not immediately for, of course, MacDonald, who remains Prime Minister for a good few years till 1935, but certainly for the reputation and the legacy of people who went into that government within the Labour Party. But maybe the tragedy, and this is our final question, maybe the tragedy for Bondfield is that even not being involved in what is seen as the great betrayal of the Labour Party didn't rescue her reputation from what I think has been, irrelevance would be putting it too strong, but just being overlooked, I think, in the decades from when she was politically active until you've written this book. The only honour that she gets, for example, seems to come in 1948 when she's made Companion of Honour. Why do you think it is that she hasn't been as well celebrated as she perhaps ought to be?
In terms of why she falls out of history, as it were, I think there's a complex range of reasons for that. In the case of her early career, historically, what we look at, if we think about the whole period of 1890 roughly through to the 1920s, we see all women's activism through the prism of suffrage. And if women were not suffragists or suffragettes, and people confuse the two these days, so which I do find infuriating. If you weren't involved in that movement, then you didn't basically have any political activity. And this is not, you only have to look at the trade union movement. There are plenty of women involved in that. There are plenty of women involved in other movements and campaigns. Most Labour and trade union women did not believe in the female suffrage movement because it was targeted at getting the vote for middle-class women and not for working-class women or working-class men. And they campaigned for what we would now call universal suffrage, which obviously we would all now support, even though many people think, oh, no, I'd have been a suffragette. Really, they wouldn't. But that meant that when the history of that movement was written, women who supported suffrage but not a limited female suffrage were regarded with particular hostility. So Sylvia Pankhurst is really quite rude, for instance, about Margaret Bondfield and says she was, never involved in any campaign for suffrage. Which is just not true. It's just she wasn't involved in that campaign for suffrage. So that's quite damaging, because it takes away her entire hinterland in the trade union movement. And then I think the effect of the 1929-31 government is, firstly, that because she is the first, she is therefore regarded as the token. And I have heard people say, oh, well, they only put her in there because they thought she was manipulable and she could be the fall guy for the mess, and she was just some woman they picked off the back benches and put into cabinet. None of which is true. They certainly can't. They knew her. They can't have thought she was malleable or easy to push into corners or prepared to take the rap for the rest of them. And she had this huge hinterland. She was an expert on the unemployment fund. It's just that she was not in a position where she could do anything to make the changes that she wanted to make. And then she made enemies of everybody during the course of the 2 years. And then she then lived a long life afterwards. And most of that government died quite young, relatively speaking, and were certainly dead by the time the Second World War broke out. I think there's only J.R. Clines who was still alive after the war, and her. And so she became a sort of relic of the pre-war period, which came to seem very quickly very far away. And then she destroyed one half of her archive, gave the other half to an American friend, and it got lost. Well, it didn't get lost. It was in the basement of an American university, and nobody knew it was there. And so there were attempts in the 1970s to write a biography of her, which had to be abandoned because the guy who was trying to write it couldn't find any archive material to base it on, or anybody who knew where any of it might be. And it was only once Vassar College digitised their archive, that people realised that there was actually something there. So, I mean, that's her fault, and not. And also, she destroyed a huge amount of material, and her secretary said that she didn't destroy anything important, just letters from people like George Bernard Shaw. At which point, you just want to weep. And so we don't know what's lost. It's very difficult to put together a much more detailed biography of her. So you put all those things together, and also she doesn't fit. As the last point, she doesn't fit what we want our pioneers to be. So people would be much happier if Ellen Wilkinson was the first female cabinet minister, because, you know, Jarrow Marches and Red Ellen and all of that stuff, much more romantic figure to have as the pioneer. And Margaret Bondfield doesn't have any of that, and she was a generation older than Ellen Wilkinson. She was 50 by the time she got into Parliament. It's just not what we see our pioneers as being made of. But I think pioneers are ordinary women who take the risk, and that's what Margaret Bondfield did, and that's why I think she should be remembered. In terms of her achievements, I think in government, relatively few, because the times were not for achievements. They're just trying to keep the ship afloat was the best that they were going to do in those governments. But I think elsewhere, lots of them. So she and a woman called Margaret Llewellyn Davis were responsible for getting the government in 1912 to pay maternity benefit to mothers rather than fathers, which seems like a no-brainer now, but was a massive fight at the time, and made a huge difference to women. It was one of the few pieces of bits of money that women had that was their own. I think her achievements as a trade unionist were considerable. I think her ability, which deserted her at the end, but her ability for most of her career to build relationships, to have friendships, to take people with her, to make something out of nothing, which is basically what the trade union movement was trying to do in its early days, is considerable. And because we have much less interest in trade union history than we have in other forms of history, we miss all of that. We miss the enormous achievement of working people to organise themselves and get something from it. And she was an integral part of that, and should be better be remembered.
Well, Nan, your book, Margaret Bondfield, The Life and Times of Britain's First Female Cabinet Minister, goes a considerable way to correcting that great absence in history and restoring Margaret Bondfield to her rightful place in the Labour pantheon, with all the complexities of her life, her career, and her service in government. It's an extraordinary story, and it's a great achievement to have been able to pull together all those different pieces of archival material, to bring in the Vassar work, to bring in the diaries, to bring in the correspondences with Ramsay MacDonald and many other figures, and you weave this story together so well. So thank you very much for writing the book, and thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.